You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at The Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. This week we discuss political extremism and its sources. Our guest is Patrick Tomassi. He teaches math and science at Trinity Academy in Portland, Oregon. His works have appeared in Public Discourse and America. Mr. Tomassi is also a contributing editor at Veritas Journal and helps organize the annual New York Encounter. Of special interest to some of our listeners, he was off and on homeschooled and belongs to Communion and Liberation, founded by the late Msgr. Luigi Giussani. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, granted by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Patrick, if I may, how did you come to interview people in Portland's ongoing and evolving or devolving protests?
Well, it is, yeah. So the protests here have been going since the the day after George Floyd was killed, and and at a certain point, I realized that there was a disconnect even within my family about knowing what was happening in Portland, which had to do with where we were getting our news. And in the majority of the news we were getting about what was happening in Portland was coming from national news sources, not local ones. But even between the national news sources, there was, a lot of just straight up disagreement, just things that couldn't both be true. And so there was an argument in my family over like, is downtown Portland burning or is it not? Type of thing, and so after that, I said, you know what, I'm just going to go see for myself. So I went, and I've been writing about various things all summer, and I thought, well, I might end up interviewing people. So I brought my recorder and talked to a few people, and the piece kind of just came out of that, because I started to find that there was a lot more nuance than what was being reported.
Now, Christopher and Mario have been tuning in insofar as they can to Portland from afar. I wonder what sorts of messages have you been getting about Portland, and what sorts of questions would you like to pass on to Patrick?
Well, good morning, but go ahead.
Just saying,
Right.
go ahead, Mario. It's fine.
No, what I wanted to say is that your assertion, I think, is very interesting, that the issue of what's happening depend on how the news or the channel that you are watching is narrating the event. Mm-hmm. And so what is hidden from the viewers are reality itself. So you decided to go to see by yourself. Now, right. Listening to you, I'm wondering what then myself, who live far away from the event, would have a real sense of what was happening. In other words, are we then trapped into an atmosphere of these people who are narrating the news? What would be then the alternative?
I think, to some extent, you are. The thing that I've found, other than just going and talking to people, that seems to work is to pull up. I have 5 websites that I pull up that are kind of from various places on the political spectrum to just see how does each of them talk about what's happening. And it seems like, if you can find a commonality between all of them, then that would be true. And oftentimes what I find is that they are talking about the same events, but they're spinning them in very different ways. And I can say, well, okay, so that thing did happen. How to interpret that fact is in question. But oftentimes the fact and the interpretation are so interwoven in the narrative of a piece that they're sort of inextricable. I honestly don't know other than that, because I don't. Yeah, I mean, it gets to this question of authority and trust that we have, we are struggling with as a country, I think, and probably other places, that there's, an eroded sense of public trust, eroded trust in the media, and increasingly, well, it seems increasingly, I could be wrong on that people report what fits their biases.
Yeah, I wonder, we talk about eroded trust in the media, but if you actually look at the history of media, I think it's always been rather untrustworthy. I think back to the yellow journalism. I was writing an American history text, and I was looking at the Spanish-American War and the whole question of the destruction of the Maine and what happened and how it was used by Pulitzer and Hearst to whip up a war, even though they had no evidence that the Spanish were actually responsible. I think too, Hilaire Belloc one point talks about how should you read the news? And he says, well, you basically pretty much you look at the middle, but then you also read the extreme right and the extreme left, and you kind of cobble these things together. But I wonder what did you find in Portland that was they talked about the same events, but did you find did your experience lead you to think that both sides are untrustworthy in the
media
reporting, and what sort of things, like can you give examples of that?
Yeah, so both sides of the media. Let's see. I think that the biggest example would be when the federal occupation in Portland happened, which I touched on briefly, not in my piece in Public Discourse, but in the sort of precursor to that in a publication called Breaking Ground, which everyone knows sort of the basic idea, but the protests were targeting the Justice Center, which is where the courthouse is, and some other things, and the federal government stepped in, and there was, and I think federal occupation is not an unfair characterization of that area. And there are some things. So if you look at the New York Times, the way the New York Times reported it, right, you see only, essentially, at least I saw, almost only things about the police doing, well, the federal police doing inappropriate things to protesters. So there are some really awful things that happened. A guy got gas canned in the head, his head got split open. He wasn't doing anything. There's a pretty iconic video of this veteran who was there protesting and just standing there and getting beaten with batons. Right. So those are the things you see, and essentially only those things from one side. And then if you look at the other side, you see only the bad things that protesters are doing, which, I mean, I stood there and watched as a protester shot fireworks at a cop. And the thought I had, especially because this is about human dignity, supposedly, right? The protest is supposed to be about human dignity, and you're watching somebody shoot fireworks at someone else, and it's like that man has children probably, right? Like, that's somebody's dad, and you could blind him, right? Beyond this sort of the political stuff about policing, it's a clear affront to human dignity. So I guess that's what I would say is that on one side you would see only the offenses committed by the other side, and vice versa.
So would you say then that the problem was more the media than the people themselves? Because at one point in your article, you explained that the Antifa and the Proud Boys were not really the problem. Rather, the problem was something else. You refer there to they are symptoms of a deeper social sickness. So would you mind to elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah. Let's see. I do want to say that I think there are really problematic things happening. Like, those people are doing really problematic things, really, in some cases, really bad things. I mean, it's not hard to find them, right? At least one person got murdered in a confrontation between far right and far left protesters in downtown Portland. There's these blow-ups that happen. I do think that I think, just before moving on to your question, I wanted to say that I've been thinking about this a lot recently. That if you show up wearing Kevlar and carrying a baseball bat to defend yourself, if you say, I have these things, but I'm doing this in self-defense, you increase the odds of violence taking place. And so I think most people don't realize that they say, well, the other side is violent. I'm wearing this in self-defense. But just the act of doing that makes it more likely that something violent will happen. Or that's how it seems to me, anyway. Because you don't see violence. In other situations where people don't come prepared for violence, violence tends not to take place. So there's that. But I guess to me there's a lot of things that make up what I was calling sort of a deeper social sickness. And one of them gets back to what we were talking about the media and sort of confirmation bias. So people only engage with media sources that fit their biases, and so then they only hear the news that fits their biases, and then they only think those things are happening. So if I talk to a protester I'm currently working on a piece directly about Antifa, so I've been talking to people from Antifa, and when I talk to them, they have example after example after example of police brutality, right? Because those are the things they're engaging with. And so there's this idea that my ideology dictates reality. And that's absolutely the case on both sides of the people, as far as the far right and far left. The people, the Proud Boys that I talked to and stuff, it was the same thing. And then there's this sense of demonization, and this, sorry. What I was interested in exploring in the public discourse piece was the relationship between the sense of sort of demonizing the other side and the sort of a black and white conception of reality, there's the good and the evil, how that relates to American Puritanism, which I think the connections are strong. And I've been talking with my dad about this, where, I think he got the idea when I was sort of working on this piece that I was trying to say that there was a direct line of succession between, American Puritans and Antifa. And I don't mean that, but I mean that this is this puritanical conception of reality where there are the good and the evil, and there's I mean this, that you can't move from the good to the evil. You can't, it's I forget what the exact term is, but the hardcore predestination, that under those circumstances, it doesn't make sense to associate with people who are in the camp I call, that my side thinks is the evil. So those are a couple of, I guess, pieces of that social sickness. And then the other one, and I think this one, especially with the Proud Boys, was really strong because the Proud Boys is mostly millennial men. It's all men, and most of the ones I met are millennials to maybe a generation older. Is loneliness, and the fact that a lot of these social groups, or like things like community organizations, have diminished. And at the same time, things like, obviously, church attendance has diminished and stuff like that. So a lot of the places that people would normally experience have a robust experience of community are gone. And the guys I talked to expressed this sense of like, well, I was lonely, and these guys, I needed drinking buddies, and I found these guys. And so I guess those are the three pieces that I point to in the article.
But you didn't find, did you, Patrick? You didn't find many haters on either side.
It depends. I should have actually made this a little more clear in the article. It depends on how you mean the word. So if I asked somebody, I'm interviewing two of the leaders of Rose City Antifa, which is the oldest Antifa in the United States, tomorrow. And if I ask them, what do you think of Trump supporters, right? I'm sure the answer I get will be vitriolic. When I asked somebody at the Proud Boys rally, is Joe Biden a socialist or a communist? Can't remember what I asked, but the answer is vitriolic. People are ready and willing to spew hate about ideas and people that fit into those ideological groups, or what I think is that ideological group. But they don't. Then when you ask them, well, what do you want to see? What kind of policy proposals would you be interested in seeing? Most of it seems very reasonable. I mean, it might be things that people would disagree about, and in the past, I think people would be welcome to have those sorts of disagreements. I don't have some rosy view that American public discourse has been all kind words in the past or something, but maybe without baseball bats or guns. But I didn't meet people that were necessarily filled with hate for individuals. I would say I want to couch that a little bit. The Antifa people, and not just the Antifa people, but just the people at the anti-police protests. Not everybody there is Antifa. There's a tendency on that side, it seems, to see the views of the other side as being incomprehensible. Like it is, like the only way that anyone could. This is a common one. The only way that anyone could support Trump is because they're a violent racist. And So that's, when you think somebody's a violent racist, then, you are sort of justified in at least hating violent racism, if not hating violent racists. Then it's easier to hate that side. But then when it came to individuals, it was sort of like, wow, those people are deeply ignorant. That's what they tended to say. More things like, these people are extremely ignorant. They listen to Trump and believe what he says. And on the other side, it's more of that view, that people on the left are ignorant elitists.
Now, there's a internal dynamic afoot with both sides. Speaking very, very broadly, there are probably 27 sides, but with both sides, there's something going on now with the protesters I hate to talk this way, on the left, and I'm doing that only for an abbreviation. There's a real split developing, anarchists and non-anarchists. For the first time ever over the weekend, I saw an in-depth article, I think it was in the LA Times, about the anarchists who are very explicitly anarchists, who like to use the language "no masters," drawing on the anarchist traditions of the early part of the last century. There's that split, and then you've pointed out to me that there's now with the Proud Boy constellation, there are those who are taking race very, very seriously and in a very, very exclusionary way. So both sides seem to be going their less than merry ways. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I've been following this split in the Proud Boys. So the Proud Boys had a little I don't know what you call it, a blowout, where a former leader of the Proud Boys, Kyle Chapman, started his own group. He basically said, "I'm reclaiming the Proud Boys. I'm taking it back from Enrique Tarrio, who is the Afro-Cuban, the current leader." But he said, "I'm taking it back, and it's going to be the Proud Goys," which goy, like for goyim, is the Jewish term for Gentiles. So obviously immediately it's like, wow, okay, so this is probably anti-Semitic. And then I've followed some of the stuff they're saying, and it's straight up white supremacist. There's no question. It is, and they're making the case, which is, I think, kind of fascinating to watch. They're making the case that, well, you can't actually be a quote-unquote Western chauvinist without being a white supremacist, because, and we're talking about, these are the Western chauvinists making this case. This is not people on the left. This is people on the far right saying, well, you actually can't be a Western chauvinist without being a white supremacist. That's why we're white supremacists. So there's that rift, which, I mean, the interesting thing to me about that is that's exactly the argument made on the other side. Basically people on the left have been saying, well, okay, they call themselves Western chauvinists and not white supremacists, but if you look at what that Western chauvinism entails, it's a lot of these things that are dog whistle white supremacy. And I guess the Kyle Chapman crowd has given up on the dog whistle and has just decided to start shouting it instead. Or that's at least one way to interpret it. On the other hand, the split with the more anarchists, the more anarchist side of the left, honestly, I want to be careful how I say this. I am engaging mostly with, at this point, just in terms of who I'm trying to talk to and get a sense of, with the anarchists, not necessarily with leftists who are not anarchists. Definitely, you see. I think as the co-option of some of the, at least in places like Portland, some of the Black Lives Matter stuff being co-opted by anarchists. As that happened, public opinion about Black Lives Matter shifted back towards the center, towards being less positive. So right after George Floyd was killed, the public opinion shifted from most everyone not supporting the Black Lives Matter movement to most everyone supporting them. And then as time wore on, as places like Portland continued to have these problems, that needle moved back. And to me, it seems like a lot of that is because anarchists started using those protests as a vehicle to do things like light the police precinct or the police union building in my neighborhood on fire.
And trash the Democratic Party headquarters.
Right, I was there. Trash one of the most socially justice-oriented Catholic parishes. Right. Yeah. So I'm working on. Both the two pieces I'm working on right now. One of them is about the parish that was attacked, where I used to volunteer when I was in college, and it is. At St. Andre Reset, which is, they have been doing services for the homeless in downtown Portland for, I believe, over 30 years at least. And it used to be called the Downtown Chapel, and then when Andre Reset was canonized, they changed names. But it was a couple people, right, or maybe even just one guy that brought a hammer and came and broke every window. And actually stopped their services for a week to the homeless in the neighborhood. So there's that, and then the no masters thing I think is interesting because the protest that I went to where they broke it was called direct action. So I don't think Antifa people prefer the term protest. But it was definitely an explicitly sort of Antifa autonomously organized event. And it was, the theme was no good presidents. So they were, chanting F Biden, and stuff. And then when you see the photos of the Democratic headquarters in Portland, you have, I think no good presidents and F Biden and some other stuff are graffitied on it.
Yeah.
I'd like to, if possible,
go ahead, Christopher.
The whole question of the race question. The impression I got, like with the Democratic primaries, both this year and in 2016, is that you had a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who seemed to want to move away from race questions and try to unite blacks and whites in a common working class movement. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of resistance to that. I sometimes wonder. I mean, I see footage of these protests, and I notice it's very mixed. I mean, there's a mixture of races. Do you have any impression? To what degree is for a lot of the protesters, is this purely racial policies, or is that just becoming kind of a vehicle to express discontent over economic problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first Black Lives Matter protest that I went to in, I think it was mid-July, the majority of people when I arrived at about 7 p.m. were definitely there to confront racism. That's how they thought of what they were protesting. As the night wore on, you started to see these people that, were wearing helmets and that had, these sort of things that you don't typically bring to a protest. And so you started to see them who were more interested in, I don't know if really in economic questions even, just in some concept of anarchy. Gosh, I had somewhere I wanted to go with that. Portland is extremely white. Even by those standards, the protests have been very white. So the Portland's about 7% black, and then other minorities make up a a larger percentage, but not much compared to the white population. But the protests have been like the Black Lives Matter protests as they wore on got more and more white. And as that happened, that pivot to anti-police, more explicitly anti-police happened. But I haven't heard a ton from people about economic problems more broadly. I don't think.
May I ask a question going back to your view about the puritanical conception of reality?
Uh-huh.
I find that very, very compelling. And if I understand well, at the end of this conception, there is an utopian society, the New Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that is also the narrative of many ideologies, and in this case, we may say, well, these two groups or the group may hold themselves an ideology, a view of realities, and they are marching toward that utopian place, utopian society, whether they are Antifa or the anarchist. So, did you find a clear sense of what that utopian society looks like for them, or they are just fighting for something that they may not see clearly in the future? Is there any ideal society to which they are moving toward? And so, what do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see. On the anarchist side, that is such a good question. I'm gonna try actually to explore that tomorrow when I talk to people more, because mostly the answers I've been getting are really vague. It's definitely a society that has no policing or anything like what we see, but has no government. I mean, I think that's normal anarchist stuff. But they do have an idea of like, well, people, you do need things like roads. So then there's this. It's one of the weird things that I've been trying to get at more, or trying to understand more, is that you do see these little echoes of like Catholic social teaching. So the principle of subsidiarity. So both solidarity and subsidiarity show up in the way that Antifa talk about what they want, but there's no conception. Well, it doesn't seem that there's a conception of original sin. So there's an idea that once you organize society in this way, where people, take care of those around them, then things will be good. But I don't, as opposed to something like distributism, where there's a clear proposal for what a just society would look like. I don't think that there's a particularly well fleshed out one with the anarchists.
Well, I'm going to add in, since nobody else is picking up. And my middle name is Batinsky. Unless, Mario, you have a follow-up.
Yes. I understand that there is no clear-cut outline of what that future society looks like. It seems to me that if I have followed quite accurately your narrative, the same type of behavior, I don't know how to call behavior, you find in some political movement anywhere. And in Argentina right now, there is also this sense of Puritanism in the big Peronista movement, which tried to propose a view of society they claim to be reflect the identity of the country, the sense of belonging to the country. Now, when you see that as a way of understanding reality, that excludes everyone else. Now, when they tried to impose that or propose that by democratic means, because the current president was elected democratically, then in their proposal they mix the proposal with some claims which are the opposite to the society they are looking for. In other words, if they come from a social Christian background, which more or less is what the Peronista movement was at one point, now, yesterday the president is proposing a abortion law, which is contradict profoundly the ideal society they are looking for. So my question, I think, is, well, what is happening now? Is just this attitude of a certain movement to build a pure society a reaction to this more pragmatic way of governing that represent, I don't know, Biden or Trump or any other president who are claiming one thing and doing a different thing? And so somehow they are the way that society is reacting to that, to this kind of more cynical way of looking at politics.
Yeah, that I mean I think I agree with you. I think that there's a deep frustration in both groups on both sides here with the sort of politics as usual thing, because they see, and I think in some cases rightly, that it's the sort of the Pete Townsend meet the new boss, same as the old boss situation, where they say, well, actually Biden isn't that much different from, well, if not Trump, is not that much different from Bush or whatever, and so there's like a deep frustration with like the lack of progress, and they definitely, like everyone at these Antifa direct actions, well, everyone that will talk to me, which is very few people, but everyone that will talk to me says, politics isn't working, politics doesn't work. This is the system functioning as designed, so we need to throw it out and make a new one. As far as adopting the means that are contrary to their ends, I think I'm not entirely sure on that. I mean, I definitely think that the Antifa people, they have a deep belief that dialogue is no longer possible, and so what we need to do is push the world towards some revolution. So I think that's why they're more comfortable with violence than other groups might be.
And so
I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yes. Do you think then the American people in general are accepting these means or violence as a means to achieve some ends? Accepting political violence?
I definitely do not think so. I'm hoping to ask tomorrow the Antifa people. One of the questions that I sent them in my prep for the interview was, who does this help? And like what evidence do you have that this method affects the aims that you're shooting for? Because I think that increasingly people are looking at the things like the Democratic headquarters getting trashed or whatnot, and saying like, okay, we've put up with this for long enough. These people don't have anything to say. So I don't think it's working. I don't think it's drawing anyone to their side.
I wonder if the anarchists with whom you speak, and did I hear you say that not that many of them are willing to speak with you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. I wonder if they have a grounding in the philosophical tradition of anarchism, which is really quite highly developed. I'm looking at a book, believe it or not, I was reading it in college, called Patterns of Anarchy, a collection of writings on the anarchist tradition. And there's a very, very complex and carefully argued anarchist literature, including something written from the evolutionary perspective that takes us all the way back to Kropotkin. And of course, in the Catholic worker movement, there's been a long and anarchist stream of thought, sometimes reconstructed and sometimes not. And in Jewish thinking, in many respects, some of the social writings of Martin Buber are highly compatible with traditions within the anarchist heritage, if we can call it that. And there's the sharp split between anarchists who are pacifists and anarchists who are not. And I'm just curious how many of the anarchists that are afoot in Portland have really done any homework, or are they limited to pamphlets of the day? And I think that would be worth exploring if you could get any of them to speak up. And perhaps one of the reasons why they don't speak up is they don't have shit to say. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Could you say a little bit about some of the heroes that you've encountered? And this might be heroes that you've encountered in your work with the New York Encounter, people who listen to both sides and keep listening and keep saying things and keep modeling frank and candid discussions, which is what I like even more than dialogues.
Yeah. I'll point to two. So from the New York Encounter this year, I actually got to have dinner with this person after his event. This year we invited a gentleman named Daryl Davis, who is a black blues musician who used to play piano for Chuck Berry, and he's a really well-known blues musician. And Daryl has spent the last 20 or more years befriending men in the Ku Klux Klan and getting them to leave, but not by necessarily like telling them, oh, you need to leave, but by befriending them and them having an experience of friendship with a black man who they couldn't possibly see as inferior. And so we invited him, and he shared a stage with Christian Petrolini, who is the former leader of the American neo-Nazis, who now runs a group that is works to help people get out of hate groups. And I am really struck by Daryl's and Christian's freedom, if that makes sense, or their courage in front of the challenge of actual white supremacists and stuff like that. I think it's easy to demonize some of the protest groups when you don't realize that like white supremacists do really exist, and some of those groups are growing. And Daryl recognizes that, and also recognizes that if it's not through dialogue, then it will not change. And discussion, and friendship. The other person I want to point to is a neighbor of mine, Terrence Moses. So I talked about him in my first article about the protests. The police union building in Portland is in our neighborhood, and it's right down the main drag of this neighborhood called Kenton. And there's a bunch of businesses in Kenton that have been trying to survive during the pandemic. So they had just created this street area where they can have, certain restaurants can serve outside. This is in the middle of the summer. And protesters got pushed from the police union building after, I think, lighting it on fire, pushed up into the neighborhood, and they started to trash the neighborhood. And Terrence, at like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, who is a neighborhood a resident in the neighborhood, a business owner, head of the Kenton Business Association. He mustered a bunch of people, including a bunch of those other business owners, to go and clean up the neighborhood. And he's also a black man, and this is when it was a little bit more the question about like anarchists and Black Lives Matter being in the same events. Was a little bit more muddy because now they just generally, at least here in Portland, I don't think they usually are at the same events. But he, I had a really good conversation with him where he basically said, look, like if you want to help end, systemic racism, talk to some black people about what they experience, but don't tell us what we need, that we need to overthrow everything and then burn down our neighborhood, because that's not going to help. And I think of Terrence as definitely a hero in a small way in this neighborhood, because he's and in the situation in Portland, because he's out there doing the real work of helping to hold the community together while not backing down from the real problems of racism and stuff.
Has he gotten any attention from the media?
Yeah, he has gotten some. I think, I found out, I heard about him doing that, leading that cleanup because they played a little clip of him on the news. But since then, I believe he's been interviewed in some national publications that are bigger than the ones I write for. Not necessarily a ton, though.
Well, at least his voice is coming through. I'd like to mention that back in the 70s, coming out of Berea College in Appalachia, a small Christian college, there's a publication, Katalagete in Greek and Be Reconciled in English, that has all kinds of essays and discussions and so forth, back and forth between stout-hearted white Baptist preachers and Klan members. And the idea was be reconciled, coming from St. Paul, of course. And so efforts of this sort of definitely made. And then during that period as well, there's the whole Koinonia community experiment. So there's so much in recent history, semi-recent history, which I guess is the history that's first forgotten, and then so much going way, way back. And now I'm shifting gears, and partly this is to just set the stage to get you back on this here program of ours on another matter altogether. History has to do with history books and who writes them and why they write them. And one of our panelists, Christopher Zender, writes history books. And I wonder, Patrick, if you could say just a bit to get us thinking about our next discussion of how history was treated in your homeschooling and how homeschoolers have tended to treat history. And then Christopher could say a little bit about his second wave, better wave treatment of history for homeschooling groups.
Oh boy. Okay, this is a big question. Well, I wrote a long piece in America Magazine talking about my starting from my own experience growing up in Catholic homeschooling and looking at some of the books that we used and that are very, very common in Catholic homeschooling still. That don't. Well, let's see. I was looking specifically at these books and how they deal with issues surrounding race. And by issues surrounding race, I mean colonialism. I mean slavery, Reconstruction, the period between Reconstruction and Civil Rights Movement, westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, the treatment of Native Americans. All sorts of things like that. Looking at this, particularly this one American history book, Christ in the Americas, and I was really surprised reading it. I had a vague sense because I'd read it, when I was young, I had a vague sense of it not doing much when it came to the history of the civil rights movement, for example. But when I opened it up and found that it had one paragraph about the civil rights movement, I think it's one. I wrote the piece a while ago. That mentions only Martin Luther King, meaning there's no Medgar Evers, there's no Malcolm X, there's no Rosa Parks. There's not even the real heroes of the civil rights movement, and that the period between Reconstruction and the civil rights movement got even less treatment. The mistreatment of black people by the Ku Klux Klan is almost not mentioned. The only mention of it says, not only did, this is not a direct quote, but my recollection is something like, not only did the Klan target African Americans, they also targeted Catholics and Jews. So in the one sentence that mentions it, it's in order to say something else. So I wrote about those books, and particularly that one, like I said, and how I think that what's wrong is this sort of just blind spots where somebody sees, these are the things that I think are important, and they don't realize what they're leaving out. So I don't think that the author of that book is a racist. I think she just didn't know how much she was leaving out and how important, relatively important those things were. But there's a pattern of what's left out. And so I looked into that, and then I interviewed a lot of black Catholics who homeschool about their experience in homeschooling, and in what ways curriculum and in what ways attitudes within Catholic homeschooling, mostly Catholics, reflect some of those problems in curriculum.
All right, Christopher, follow up.
Well, I agree. I know the book you're talking about, and I used to teach from it when I was a classroom teacher, and I found it inadequate for similar reasons, not just for the racism, but more with a kind of sense of whitewashing Catholic history. And there has been, I know of one fellow in particular who writes history, whose opinion is that, well, since the secular textbooks speak so badly of the Catholic Church, I'm going to speak well of the Catholic Church, and so it's like a seek and known sort of treatment. It's just that he has the seek and the other side has the known, and that's what I do with the Catholic Textbook Project. We've worked to get beyond that and to have history which is engaging to read, but also which tells the history of the warts and all. So that's been our what we've been up to for the past since about the year 2000, and we sell mostly in Catholic schools, but we also have a very large homeschooling group of people who buy from us. So, including you mentioned Colby Academy, they use our books now. So I was going to ask
you, did I mention the Catholic Textbook Project in my piece? I don't recall.
No, you didn't.
Oh, okay. Because they told me about that, and I had thought at one point I should reach out to somebody in the Catholic Textbook Project. It would have probably been you. I wish I had.
Yes, I think you're very right about the tendency, and I think it comes from a certain generation in particular, which has seen itself as being under siege. So the idea is we have to put the best foot forward, but put the best account. But I know I had a student in the book you're talking about. One of my smarter students. He came up to me. He says, Mr. Zander, he said, Catholics weren't always good, were they? He says, no, they weren't. And that's what I do. It's my history classes where I would just assign them reading in the book, but then I would just take copious notes myself and lecture them, adding things in that they weren't in their readings. So I think that's a real problem, and what the causes of it are, I think, is that kind of siege mentality. And oftentimes it's not just that; it's political. It's a political sense that as Catholics we have to be aligned to one side or the other in our national politics. And generally for Orthodox Catholics that means the Republican Party. So McCarthy, for instance, has to be put in the best possible light. The other side, of course,
Right.
the problem is that it's a demonization of the other side, and no side wants to actually take a particular historical character and speak truthfully about him or her, and that makes both for inaccurate history, but it also makes for boring history, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about the siege mentality. I think that's really true. And as far as the politics thing, one thing with the book I wrote about is the obsession, I think, with communism, and everything in the post World War II era is about the author kind of talking about how bad communism is.
Right.
So all history is sort of in service to a political aim.
Right. And I think, the difficulty, too, is that we Catholics who do this sort of stuff are just not sufficiently Catholic. We take our cues from our society. We're first Americans is the problem, and then we're Catholics. And we fit the Catholic Church, which is, I think, been a problem in the Catholic Church in the United States, since the beginning.
Yeah, we got an encyclical about it.
Yeah. I mean, we want to just fit in, and you can understand why a bunch of immigrants who had their churches burnt down and things of that sort wanted just to fit in. But we've not engaged the society. We've not actually spoken as Catholics to society, and that's one of the chief problems. And it's the root of this historical account problem that you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely. But
we certainly have a strange world that we live in. On the one hand, there was the obsession with communism that you mentioned, and today we have kind of at the highest level a resolute insistence on ignoring what the Communist Party is doing in China. There are so many wild inconsistencies and so many wild fluctuations that you got to keep your head on straight, and that's not easy. I think one group that
don't acknowledge that they're genociding the Uyghur Muslims.
Yeah, all in the name of religious freedom. We're not going to acknowledge that.
Right.
Well. Now, one group that seems to have kept its head on straight, and I was privileged to be a participant for a time, is, correct my Italian, Comunione e Liberazione, and that's something that we'll have to get you back to speak of as well. However, we are coming to the end of our hour, and we have a particularly challenging gospel. Some people find it enigmatic, and I think what it's telling us is be sure you're doing the very best with what you have. It's from the Gospel according to Luke. While people were listening to Jesus speak, he proceeded to tell a parable because he was near Jerusalem, and they thought that the kingdom of God would appear there immediately. So he said, a nobleman went off to a distant country to obtain the kingship for himself and then to return. He called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 gold coins and told them, engage in trade with these until I return. His fellow citizens, however, despised him and sent a delegation after him to announce, we do not want this man to be our king. But when he returned after obtaining the kingship, he had the servants called to whom he had given the money to learn what they had gained by trading. The first came forward and said, Sir, your gold coin has earned 10 additional ones. He replied, well done, good servant. You have been faithful in this very small matter. Take charge of 10 cities. Then the second came and reported, your gold coin, sir, has earned 5 more. And to this servant too, he said, you take charge of 5 cities. Then the other servant came and said, Sir, here is your gold coin. I kept it stored away in a handkerchief for I was afraid of you, because you are a demanding man. You take up what you did not lay down, and you harvest what you did not plant. He said to him, with your own words I shall condemn you, you wicked servant. You knew I was a demanding man, taking up what I did not lay down and harvesting what I did not plant. Why did you not put my money in a bank? Then on my return I would have collected it with interest. And to those standing by he said, take the gold coin from him and give it to the servant who has 10. But they said to him, Sir, he has 10 gold coins. He replied, I tell you, to everyone who has, more will be given, but from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Now as for those enemies of mine who did not want me as their king, bring them here and slay them before me. After he had said this, he proceeded on his journey up to Jerusalem. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.